Hello, and welcome to the Content Advantage, a talk show about content for content professionals, folks like you, hopefully, who are tuned in today. I'm Scott Abel, and with me today is my co-host, Megan Gahuli.
Hey, Scott. How you doing?
Hi there. Nice to see you, Megan.
You too. So we talk a lot about how unprotected data and poor cybersecurity practices can sometimes make companies vulnerable to data losses, to breaches, and we know that companies need to combat the malicious intent of cyber criminals. And to do that, they really need to make prevention, awareness, best practices of cybersecurity part of their culture. And we know that everyone, including TechCom teams, has a role in that. So today we've invited a TechCom specialist, John Kearney, to talk to us about his job as a technical writer for a cybersecurity agency and the valuable lessons that he's learned along the way. Welcome to the Content Advantage, John.
Hey, welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
Very good. So just so you know, I used to work for a company in identity and access management. And I know from that experience how much you learn about security being on the inside of a company like that. And so I know that you've learned a tremendous amount about cybersecurity in general. I also know, having managed technical writers at that team, that there are a lot of things you can do as a technical writer to avoid some of these snafus that sometimes companies find themselves in around cybersecurity. So why don't you give us a bit of an introduction about you and what your line of work is and what your connection is to the subject of today's show?
Yeah, sure. So I started in technical communication over 20 years ago now. And I started in a very traditional sense, writing online help guides and manuals for insurance broker software. But not long after that, about a year and a half later, I got a job in the public sector in a very large agency that and the particular department I was in was specializing in cybersecurity. It's kind of my first exposure to it. And I did that for 6.5 years, and I absolutely loved it. It's a really interesting subject, and it's a subject which it needs people in it to explain what are complex and sometimes alarming concepts to people so they can understand things better and so they can become more secure. Now, then I left the sector, redundancies, I moved on, and I always wanted to get back into cybersecurity. And in 2018, I got the chance to. And since 2018, I've worked both for a company that is on the red team side of things, so the attacking side of things, that test people's security by attacking it, and on the blue team side of things. So currently with a company that provides a lot of services and information for people who want to be more secure. So that's kind of my background.
Excellent. Well, before we jump in and start talking about the red and blue teams, let's tell the audience a few things about today's show and the interface that we're using. First, today's show is being recorded, so at any time if you need to leave today a little bit early, don't worry, you can catch a recording of the event just by returning to use the same URL that you're using to watch today's live show. About 30 minutes after the show ends today, it turns into a recording that you can watch at your leisure or share with others, and we hope that you get a chance to do that. Also, don't worry about your camera or your microphone. We can't see or hear you. Hopefully you can see and hear us. And at any time during the show, if you feel the urge, you can ask a question by clicking the Ask a Question button located in your webinar viewing panel. That will trigger a little chat area where you can text a question to us. We can't text you back, but we will be aware that you've texted in a question, and we'll try to ask John as many questions as we can with the time that we have available on the show. And there's additional content located in the attachments and links section of your webinar viewing panel today. You can find a 40% discount on ebooks from our friends at XML Press, content from our regular guest presenter, and from our sponsor Zoom. And just a quick note about the ebook sale from XML Press. You can visit the store link at store.xmlpress.com, which is also located in your webinar viewing panel, to take advantage of the code that's there that gives you the 40% discount. So definitely check that out on your way out today. And speaking of on your way out, I'll remind you at the end of the show to give us a rating from 1 to 5 stars. 5 is a high star rating and 1 is low. There's also a little field that you can share your thoughts about John's talk today. And I know that he'd appreciate that. So thank you. Megan, let's dive right into today's show.
Let's do it, definitely. So let's start at the beginning. John, why is it important for our audience to even think about cybersecurity?
Cybersecurity is thinking about you already. It's a massively it's a hot topic of the day, isn't it? I mean, you know, almost not a day goes by that even in mainstream media outlets now you're seeing things about security. So it is a really, really important thing to pay attention to. And yeah, the agency I'm working with at the moment, they are providing services, as I've said, to help mostly public sector organizations become more secure, but also some other services that in time members of the public might have access to as individuals as well. And it's about helping them be more secure. Now, when I got back into this field a little while ago, I met up with a friend of mine when I was in London, who works in cybersecurity and has been for quite some time. And what he said to me was, he said, I'm glad you're in the field because there's a severe lack of commas in InfoSec, is the way he put it. There are some good writers, there are some good people who do some good work, and obviously you can find them in a lot of different places. But sometimes some of this content that goes out is very much written by people who are extraordinarily clever, but aren't necessarily all that good at addressing different audiences, which is, of course, where technical communicators come in. And that's our job specialization, really.
Yeah, I know the feeling of talking to people who are absolutely brilliant in their field, but maybe they have a tougher time communicating it. So I think there's two sides of that story. The most obvious is that as a technical writer, you help to take their words and make it make sense to the general population, right? So that's kind of the obvious side. But you also mentioned that in addition to that, you do a lot of helping them to better communicate within their organization and just get their messages more effectively. Can you talk a little bit about what that entails?
Well, yeah. So it's the best way to describe this. So currently I'm working within a part of an organization that has never had a full-time writer. And so there are people who need to communicate their requirements and user feedback and all kinds of things with each other. And that's there's a translation job to do there as well. There's very often people traditionally think about technical communicators create user-centered content. And people often think of, well, there's a user and they're over there. They're outside the organization. But of course, the reality is, as we all know, in all kinds of technical communication, there are users within an organization as well. There's your professional services team, there's your product team, there's your marketing team, and all these people need to understand what's going on. And with cybersecurity, that's obviously very important as well.
You know, it seems like cybersecurity is everybody's job, which I think is the point that you're trying to make as well. But it's also interesting because I think the fictional character, the mobster Michael Corleone, used to say something like, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And so it sounds like in cybersecurity, you want to do that too. Do you get a chance to work with hackers or people who are trying to probe our systems to better understand how intruders might take advantage of opportunities to get past the security we have in place?
Yeah, so you have, as I mentioned earlier, you have the concept of blue team and red team. And a blue team,
can you explain?
Yeah, sure. A blue team could be inside an organization or an agency who is outside, and they help your systems become more secure. So they will update your software, they'll apply patches, they'll advise you which software to use, and anything else. It's defensive. Red team is offensive. A red team will, at its simplest, will run scans against your network and give you a report saying, here's a penetration test, here are all the points that are possibly vulnerable. The company that I worked for, Tradecraft, for a couple of years, they had a very different approach. This wasn't we're going to scan your networks. This is literally, we are going to attack your systems. You're going to tell us what your worst case scenario is, and we're going to find out how that would happen.
Oh, wow.
That's really interesting stuff. Now, one of the most interesting things about it is sometimes it's something which I could do, and I'm not a hacker. Literally, sometimes it's that simple. But sometimes it's more complicated, and there's always more things that you find, right? Now, what they needed was somebody who could write, who could explain, not only explain the technical concepts and how things happen, but effectively tell a story about how this would happen to you. So we'd have the individual findings, which would have a very short description at the beginning, which would explain in very simple terms what this vulnerability would allow an attacker to do, and what kind of attacker. And then a more detailed technical description and a replication. But we'd have an executive summary, which would literally tell the story about what we were able to do and how we were able to do it in lay terms, so that could be presented to board members. And then you, if necessary, would have a more technical description. And of course, the fascinating thing about writing reports like this is that you're not writing for a wide audience. You know, this report is never going to be published online, hopefully. It's only ever going to go to a few key people in an organization. But those few key people have very specific requirements for that content. They need to understand key things. And they need to be able to identify the top things they can do to instantly make themselves more secure.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's a great part of a technical documentation job in your situation is the challenge of doing this. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting to think about the number of doors that bad actors can come through. They can really come from any direction. And so it's really important to weave this into everything that your organization does. And especially now with people working from home, everything is kind of changed. But at the same time, I've seen organizations that go over the top on security to the point where employees either are living in fear or they're completely unable to do their jobs. Yeah. So how do we find that balance? What are the best practices that you've experienced for creating a really strong yet sustainable cybersecurity culture?
Yeah, so every organization has a security culture. It's whether or not it's a good one.
That's true.
That's totally true.
If you have an organization where people feel afraid, people feel that they will be blamed if something goes wrong. If they get a phishing email and they just click the link and they go, oh, God, I clicked the link. If they're in fear, they're not going to tell anyone that has happened.
Right. Yeah. Very true.
And that's bad, right? So you need to make everybody feel as if they are a member of your security. Everybody in your organization has to be considered a member of your security team. And they have to be given not just responsibilities, they have to be encouraged to learn more and to share more. And in terms of content, there's a lot of content that goes on internally to companies. And security policies are one of them. But what your security policies must absolutely not be is like this, right? So a lot of us will.
That's funny.
In this case, you start a new job, you get to the office, or in these pandemic times, you might just get documents sent to you or folders shared. And you have this put in front of you, go, here's our security policy, you need to read this. And sometimes they can be like dozens of pages long. And how on earth are you supposed to absorb all of that? And the reality is you're not going to. What you should in fact have is a set of key security principles that are quite simply laid out. So here's some common sense stuff, but we're calling it out for you. Don't connect strange devices to your machines. You know, if you think you make a mistake, please tell us. Here's how to do a good password. Here's how to practice good security health management. Here's how to update your system. Here are the applications you can install, all that kind of thing. But that doesn't need to be long. And if you kind of start as somebody who works in content, that is a real difference that I think you can make to your organization. If you can persuade the powers that be to let you get involved in that, I think that would be a really good start.
Wow, speaking of producing the right content for the right people under the right scenarios, this seems like a good time for us to mention that today's show is sponsored by Zoom In Software. Megan, can you tell our audience briefly what Zoom In Software does and how it can help them tackle some of their content challenges?
Absolutely. So we really look at the customer experience behind content, and many companies make it really difficult for their customers to find the answers they need. So what our platform does is we ingest technical product content from any source, whether it's structured, unstructured, no matter where it was created or how it was published. And we deliver it into a documentation portal, into your community, into your customer service site, and even into the product itself. And this enables customers to be able to self-serve more efficiently, which in turn means that organizations can reduce their support costs and they can improve product adoption.
Excellent. And I would imagine, because of all of us working from home too, they can better deliver the right pieces of information to their employees and the customers that they're trying to serve during these kind of uncertain times.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks. And you can learn more, by the way, about Zoom and software by looking in the attachments section of your webinar viewing panel, where there's some content provided by the sponsor. Also, you can, of course, point your web browser to zoomandsoftware.com and check out the great content that they have over there. All right, back to the show. John, we're increasingly being challenged to make digital products and experiences easier to use and faster to build and maintain. I think that's everybody's challenge today. How do you balance helping users without helping hackers? Can you give us an example of content that technical writers might think is useful to the intended user, and maybe it is, but could also inadvertently prove to be useful to hackers?
Yeah, so there's a classic example of this, which me bringing this up, people in the audience may well have heard of this already, is your login error messages. Say you try to log into a platform and you put your username and your password in and you get one of them wrong.
Yeah, happens all the time.
Yes.
Right? You might think it would be useful to tell somebody, oh, you've got your username wrong. We don't recognize that username. Or, oh, that password is wrong. But absolutely not. That is an absolute no-no in terms of cybersecurity. And the reason is, one of the things attackers will do when they're probing a system is try to discover valid usernames. And if they can, it's quite easy to do this in many ways. But with most companies, they will have their usernames for their staff are first name dot last name at domain.
Right. Some kind of convention.
Right. But still, it's a good idea. So just say, here's a scenario. The attacker has looked at your LinkedIn page, has searched LinkedIn for people who used to work for you and who've only recently left. Okay, maybe their accounts haven't been closed yet. Brilliant. I could, let's see, ralph.smith at acme.com. Okay, let's try this username and password. Oh yeah, that's a valid username still. Look, it says valid username, or your password is incorrect or whatever, right? You don't want that. You want the error message to just say, your login credentials are incorrect, please try again. As simple as that. Now, one of the ways I find to thinking about this is quite useful is we all know the concept of user stories, right? As a user, I want to do X so that I can do Y. Sometimes it's useful to think of attacker stories.
Ah.
Yeah. So, as an attacker, I want to be able to discover your usernames as easily as possible so that I can target individual users.
Interesting.
And try common passwords against them.
Oh, what a great idea.
Yeah.
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 That's one way of kind of fitting your head around that. Another thing which I came up against, which is I've been working on relatively recently, we're working on building this platform, as I say. And I was asked in a ticket about some content for a 404 message. We all know the 404 messages. We've all seen them. And I said, hang on, this should be a 403 message because it's actually a page that exists, but the person isn't authorized to see it. And then the product owner said, in this case, that's fine. But in other cases, we might not want to say that. So another thing an attacker will do is try to find out what pages on a website or service or whatever can be seen without logging in. Even if you can't access the content on them, if you know it exists, that may tell you something about the system you're targeting. You may be able to discover information about plugins it uses, other third-party services, and so on. All somebody should be able to see if they're not authenticated, if they're not logged in, is basically a login portal or an error message. And it may well be that you want to say that page doesn't exist when that page very well does exist, but you don't want people to know it exists unless they're logged in.
And John, is that because malicious intent of somebody trying to access the system without permission is that they may be able to reverse engineer some of what you've done too. For example, I've noticed sometimes URLs are serialized and they start numbering them, and at the end it's like article 1 2 3 4. So you could just guess that 1 2 3 4 5 might be the next article, and if that cue was given to the hacker, they might be savvy enough to figure out how to kind of get around your security.
That's exactly it. It's actually fascinating how little successful hacking doesn't require a high level of technical skill.
Wow.
It really doesn't. I mean, we've all heard about these public breaches of data, right? Where you have, I don't want to name and shame companies, but big software or finance companies, because they've been hacked and leaked and so on. And all those historic leaks, by the way, are all available online.
Right.
They're available, and attackers can build. So Alison Roberts, or say somebody has an unusual name. This was an attack actually that worked once on the first day of the test. This person who's the head of a department has an unusual name. Let's look for that name in public data breaches. Oh, look, that looks like their Hotmail address. That's the password they used. Have they used that password here? Oh, yes, we've logged in. We've got access. We've achieved the objective. We've got access to all the data. That doesn't require any technical skill at all. So this is the kind of thing so you need to be very mindful of the fact that you need to, and as a technical communicator, you may want to tell people, you may want to be really helpful to people, and that's really good, but you need to temper that with the thought that there is information that could be useful to attackers. And you need to think about whether you need to provide it or not, or where you provide that information.
Right. Yeah, the idea of going back to the 404 and 403 errors, that it's something that we don't often think about. We think about it as a usability issue, but really it makes a lot of sense that if they did manage to go through the way you mentioned and they got a username and a password, now they can go in and figure out if this user has admin privileges, maybe, right? So yeah, super interesting. So just to give some really actionable advice for our audience, what advice do you give about one of the biggest sort of, we'll call it the pains in the but also one of the biggest cybersecurity issues, passwords. How do we come up with a good password? Do we need to have like 17,000 different, we need to have caps and low caps and lower numbers and special characters and all kinds of crazy stuff? What's a good password?
Yeah, this is a great one. And I don't know, there's recently been some news in the UK press about some people who've lost their passwords to a hard drive. Some guy lost his password to a hard drive, so he can't get access to his $2.1 million worth of Bitcoin. That's it.
Oh. That'll teach you.
Yeah. So
wow,
it's harsh, isn't it? Right? And passwords are just such a tricky subject. And people have particular patterns in the way they create passwords to circumvent the rules that are intended to make passwords more complex. Because I just want to share this with you. This is a great cartoon from XKCD, which if any of the listeners haven't seen XKCD, you must look it up. Randall Munro, who wrote it, is a brilliant communicator. And this does the rounds in cybersecurity. We have trained people to use passwords that are hard to remember, but easy for computers to guess. So what is actually a much better way of coming up with a password that is easier to remember and easier to type in, right, is to string 3 or 4 random words together and maybe separate them with a dash or a full stop or whatever. And then you have something which is very long, so if a computer were going to try to randomly guess it, that would take a long time. A computer doesn't care if you've got a 0 or a 4 in your password. It really doesn't care. And the way a lot of password cracking systems actually work is not by randomly guessing. They get these cracked passwords from these public breaches and run them against your passwords, against your password hashes. I won't go into the technical explanation of that right now, maybe another time. But essentially, that's the way most of it works. And it's if you go to Wikipedia and look at the 10,000 most common passwords, which is a maintained list, you know, the most common password is 1234556. The second most common password is password. You know, this is ridiculous how simple. And bear in mind, those 10,000 most common used passwords, the attackers have that list and they run that against systems to see if they can crack passwords, right? Now, this is great, but I don't know about you, but I have lots of passwords I have to remember. You know, loads of social media, utility services, all kinds of things. This is where a password manager comes in really handy. There are lots of these available. 1Password and LastPass are the two examples that spring to mind. They will generate these random passphrases for master password, which obviously should be a passphrase, should be a very strong, long passphrase for the password manager. And then you can log into that and access your passwords and paste them in wherever you need to. It also makes it easier for you to create new passwords because it will generate these passwords for you randomly if you like. So that's a very important thing to do.
That's good advice, and thank you for sharing that, because I think that this helps people understand that there are actually better ways to remember your password. I think that's the frustration, right? Is that you created the password and you also forgot it. So you become kind of frustrated with, this system is not letting me in and my brain is not letting me remember the password. So that the password utility that I use is called 1Password. I'm not sure whether that is the best or the worst of the software. I have no way to compare or contrast them, but it does seem to do the job that you've described. It manages the complexity. It tells me that I have repeat passwords, that I'm repurposing them someplace else, and warns me that I shouldn't do that, that I should change it, and then tries to change it. So I think there's some great value there. Thanks for sharing that. It also
Scott, before you move on, there's someone in the audience who I think is trying to be funny, because this is actually very funny. Yes. Someone says, what are the, oh, it just went away. What are the characteristics? Hang on, I got to find it again. Just went away. Anyway, they basically were saying that, like, what are the chances now that the most popular password is going to be correct horse battery staple? because that one is now out there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I thought that was funny.
If we were on the Oprah show, I think our audience would be big enough to influence that.
Yes. So don't use that password per se.
Right. John, do you have any suggestions for a password manager? One of the viewers just chimed in and asked if you might.
I use 1Password personally.
Okay.
I use that because the previous employee used it. So when I left that company, I bought my own license for it, which is like a couple of quid, couple of dollars a month or something like that, and then transferred my vault over. I just copied all my passwords into a new vault. So that was the easiest thing for me to do. I understand LastPass is also good.
Yeah, I use LastPass, and it works well.
Okay, great. Well,
you must do is always keep your passwords there. Just always keep your password manager up to date. Always update the software.
Yeah,
because a password manager is a point of attack. If an attacker knows your password manager and there's a vulnerability discovered in it, they'll go after the password manager.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. And accessibility is such a hot topic, and of course it makes people frustrated when they can't access what they need. There's also some kind of a global movement that I've been paying attention to called the Valuable 500, which are big corporations that have committed to putting disability inclusion on their business leadership agenda. And they've kind of proclaimed it by signing this online petition to let people know that the accessibility means something to their company, and they make promises about what they're going to do to improve it. So can accessibility be at odds with cybersecurity? It seems like that's a natural kind of challenge between those two. What are your thoughts there?
So I would say, I mean, we're probably all familiar with the phrase, you know, good design is accessible, design is good design.
Yeah.
I see no reason why you couldn't extend that to say secure. So secure design is good design is accessible design, and so on. Yes, if you're being careful about how you share information, that might be useful to attackers, then in theory, if you're not careful, you could end up being less helpful to people who do need legitimate users. But it's just something to bear in mind when you're designing your content, which is something I'm involved in quite a bit at the moment on different services and applications.
This has dawned on me, John, but it seems like maybe there's a reason for role-based access to content that's related to resetting your password and things of that nature that maybe shouldn't be part of the public domain. Maybe you have to log in to get that kind of information, which would be something that Zoom would probably be able to help with, presenting the right content at the right moment in the content life cycle of that person, right, in their journey with your brand.
Yeah.
Is something that we're trying to do already. It seems like hiding that stuff from people until they really need it might be also part of a strategy. Is there something to that line of thinking, or is my brain just going off on a tangent?
No, there's something which often crops up in cybersecurity called the principle of least privilege, which is essentially, you should only be able, as a particular user, you should be able to do the things that you are allowed to do, and no more than that.
Yes.
There was one simulation which my previous company were running against a client, and obviously I can't say anything at all till then.
John?
I think we're losing him.
Yeah. John, your connection is maybe a little, your connection was a little unstable. Could you repeat that last sentence?
Sure. If you're familiar with the concept of a domain administrator in a Windows environment, domain administrators have essentially, godlike access. They can do anything they want.
Do anything.
On this particular simulation, we found out that domain admin privileges had been handed out like confetti. Not only that, but once you logged in to the system as any kind of user, all traffic on the inside of the network was transmitted unencrypted.
Yeah.
So a normal user could spy on other users and gather all their credentials, so could easily gain administrator credentials and do whatever they wanted. So yeah. Wow. So in terms of all kinds of things like that, obviously that's very important. But the principle of least privilege should be applied to content as well. And that is something you could talk to your security people about, and talk to the people who are responsible for defining user roles for the application or system service, whatever you're working on.
That seems like
we handle that a lot. We so at Zoom, we connect with the SSO, and it is so important to make sure that the admins that has specific privileges are the only ones that have access to the content that speaks to those privileges. So yes, it's very important. So I'm going to go back to what Scott was talking about. He was talking about accessibility, but it seems to me like a lot of just UX design in general, when you think about making things easier for the user, oftentimes that could be at odds with cybersecurity. So what kind of relationship do you maintain with the UX designers at your company to kind of negotiate the balance between good UX and good security?
Well, I consider myself extremely lucky because I finally got my wish, and I'm now working with a team of UX designers, and we are day to day, we do stuff together. And this is brilliant because I've worked in companies before where there is no UX designer and no interest in doing any kind of actual design of an application. And I'm sure we've all had to document an application which has had no design thinking whatsoever.
Yeah.
I know I had to do that a few years ago, and it was the most infuriating thing you can possibly imagine. Just different things called the same thing, same things called different things, and so on. It just becomes a total nightmare. So with the UX designers, it's brilliant. They create their designs. They get me on a call. We talk about the content in the user interface, because I'm working on basically the entire slew of user content. So from field names and little contextual help in the user interface, right the way through to, I've started looking at some API documentation recently, and also some content that goes on the web. which will explain what services are. And that's, I've been editing some today, actually, about bringing that up to date. And in all cases, we have a very design-centered approach, user-centered approach. So we are all collaborating on a daily basis, and it is the best way to work. Several years ago, I was at a TechCom's UK conference, and Ray Gallen was there.
Ah, yeah.
Ray,
We had him on the show recently. Maybe not so recently.
He's
Feels
fantastic.
like recently. Yeah.
He said technical writers should be involved at the start of the design process.
Yeah.
And, ever since then, I've tried to push myself in as early as possible, and sometimes it can make you a bit unpopular, but do it. You must do it. It is the only way to really get a good grip on what's going on and to call out problems before they happen. And if you can get with the UX team, all the better, because my experience of them so far is that they're basically my favorite people in the world.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Very good.
Certainly make or break a system, right? And I think the more that they know about our goals as a company and the things that are threats to us, the more informed they'll be about their design. I think their original request was probably not design the most secure system. It was probably design a friendly system that will make us money, right?
Yeah.
Is their goal. And I think security might get lost in there sometimes. Megan, do you want to take a look at the questions from the audience, see if there's one here before I prepare the book giveaway? So those of you who just joined us a little bit late, we're going to give away a couple copies of our book, The Language of Cybersecurity, to help you understand some of the terms that are popping around the cybersecurity arena today.
Yeah, so somebody has, this is a really good question. So they say, I figured cybersecurity was evaluating a complete system or service. Sure, individuals need to follow basic security procedures, but you'd not use TAs for that. I'm not sure what TAs are.
Technical authors.
Technical authors, got it, thank you. I should know that. How involved in system security do you get, considering that security experts spend years learning their trade? What competencies should you have to document or assist the security expert without being just a stenographer?
Brilliant. So it's very much the same as, I mean, I've worked for quite some time in different sectors. And you get people who have like a brain the size of a planet. And they're incredibly clever and they're really interesting, but my goodness, sometimes getting them to explain something simply is really difficult.
Yeah.
I worked with one gentleman once, and this is my first job in SecCom, in secure InfoSec, and he'd written an 80-page report, and his project manager said, it can't be this long. And I sat with him for a week, literally a week, and I would just look at it and I'd think, he needs to explain that concept. And so I'd say, Mark, there's a name plucked out there. Mark, can you explain what this means? And he'd spit out a perfectly formed phrase or a couple of sentences, and I just write it down. So it's just learning to communicate and speak language with people like this. But sometimes they get caught up with using jargon.
Right.
Now, jargon, it's a bit of an unfortunate phrase, but I know people are very much against jargon, but sometimes it's the matter of one person's inclusive language is another person's jargon. And luckily, there's a slide I haven't shared actually here. This is a friend of mine, old friend of mine, a lovely person, and she's really great at this. She's called this out. And this is this concept of smishing. Now, you may have heard of phishing with a PH,
yes,
which is phishing messages. They're to click a link which will take you to a malicious website, so on. Smishing is what somebody has decided somewhere we should call text messages like this, SMS. So they take an SMS and put ishing together.
Funny.
Yes, of course, we do. We portmanteau everything.
I love the way she's put it here. Her second tweet is actually a reply to me, where I said, this is kind of an established thing in InfoSec, and this is what people are saying. And she just went, I get that, but no one cares. This is a central principle of user-centered content. People who are specialists, whether it's InfoSec or whether it's any field, they will, with the best will in the world, they will very often not think about what people need to know, but they'll think about what they know, and they shoot it at them through a fire hose, you know. So that's the problem, and we do have a role there. We absolutely do. So
I'm gonna go use the word smishing with my kids. They're gonna love that word.
I can see a new XKCD cartoon on smishing sometime soon.
That's awesome.
Right. There's a comment here too. Power Utilities, one of our viewers says, is by far the most security conscious places I've ever worked. A large utility hired me once to help write cybersecurity standards, mostly for their IT department. I learned that even though many IT folks don't get security, everything John has said so far is consistent with my experience. So I don't know how many other technical communicators in the audience today have had similar experiences, but that's why we brought John on. We thought there were some lessons to learn as well for people who don't get a chance to work with InfoSec folks all the time.
Yeah.
So John,
we have time for another question?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's take one more question and then I'll
Okay, this one is really interesting. With regard to insider risks versus insider threats and insider threats, they're very sensitive issues that sometimes generate pushback from executives, either because they think insider risk isn't an issue. We've heard that. We trust our people, right?
Yes.
Or because of employee privacy concerns. So in your reports, do you write differently when you have insider versus external findings? And if so, how?
Interesting.
So the reports that we worked on, in terms of the different findings, they would explain what a person should, so when I mentioned earlier different kinds of attackers. So we have an unauthenticated attacker, which is somebody who's not logged in, somebody who hasn't logged into your system. So they've got no idea. Sometimes they can literally just do things. Then you have like submitting a web form, which may trigger a vulnerability. Then we'd have, say, authenticated attacker. We'd be very careful and we wouldn't try to finger wag and we wouldn't try to blame. Even if we found that particular accounts were configured with poor passwords, we'd have to tell them, because obviously that's important to know. But you have to be very careful not to be finger waggy, because if you get into a cycle where you're just blaming people for poor security practices, they're going to feel bad and they're not going to be incentivized to actually change their behavior. You need to give them the tools that are necessary to do a good job. You need clear policies, a password manager, for example, things like that. So yeah, it is very important to identify whether or not something can be done by somebody. I think there was a news article today, actually. Wasn't there in the States, I think, somebody used an old and quite vulnerable piece of software to try to interfere with the city's water supply?
Yes.
Yeah. And that turned out, I believe, to have been a former employee. But of course, in terms of managing insider threats, it's a really delicate subject to talk about. It's a bit of a minefield, because if you are too negative about it, people will feel as if they're being unfairly victimized, and then you will have disgruntled employees, right?
Yeah.
So you can practice good hygiene. You can make sure when somebody leaves your company, their account is shut down or deactivated within like a very short period of time, for example.
John, that's all very, very good and wise, practical information that you've shared today, and good advice. I really appreciate you doing that. But before we say goodbye, I want to give away a few copies of our book, The Language of Cybersecurity, from XML Press, just to kind of help people in the TechCom space master these vocabulary words. And our winners are going to be Yale Bassford of Axis Security, Ashley Bryan of Informatica, Fur O'Neill of ESET, Andy Mann of Workday, and Robin Van Drunen of AppRiver. All of you will receive a free copy of The Language of Cybersecurity in print form from XML Press. Don't forget, viewers of the show, you can also check out The Language of Cybersecurity at the XML Press website or at your favorite online retailer. If you use the XML Press website, you can go to the attachments and links section of today's webinar viewing panel, where there is a 40% off offer to help you get books a little bit less expensively. So thanks to the folks at XML Press for doing that. Megan and I want to thank you, John, for being on our show today. We really appreciate it. We know that you had some technical difficulties last time, and we were so glad we were able to overcome those and have you on our show today. So thank you for being here.
it's been a real pleasure, and I'd be happy to come back anytime and talk about this or something else if there's demand.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for coming, John. So I just want to say before you guys sign off, make sure that you give us a 1 to 5 star rating. You can use the Rate This tab located in your your webinar viewing panel. Definitely add some comments. We like to hear the good, the bad, the ugly. We want to know how to make this show even better for you for next time. So give us some feedback.
Excellent. And before you go, speaking of next time, I want to encourage you to be on the lookout for an email invitation to the next Content Advantage show. It's scheduled for next Tuesday, February 16th, when we get to chat with Race Bannon. He's the Senior Director of Applications Information Development at Oracle PeopleSoft, about the impact of bringing together all of the product content that you have into one online knowledge center. So you're going to want to come and learn all about how their company has been unifying content and the benefits. So we're excited to have Race on the show. We hope that you'll join us then. So until then, keep doing great work. Be safe, be well. Thanks for joining us again. Bye.
Bye.
Ensure your customers find the answers they need with Zoomin. Bring together product content from all teams and sources to deliver a unified, personalized content experience. Check us out at www.zoominsoftware.com.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye.